We're now going to explore the production process for spirits. Making a spirit involves, broadly, two main stages: fermentation and distillation. Then, for brown spirits, we add in the process of maturation. Depending on the spirit we're looking to produce, whether it's rum, tequila, gin, vodka, brandy, or whiskey, the raw materials will first require a certain level of processing to ensure that the sugars are easily accessible for the yeast. A common example of this is malted barley, which is used in many whiskey styles. Malted barley is barley which has been modified. The malting process breaks down the barley's starch content into simple sugars by encouraging the barley to grow and produce enzymes. Depending on the raw material and the spirit we're making, this processing stage will typically also involve crushing or milling the sugar cane, agave, grapes, or grains, and in some cases cooking them to a greater or lesser degree. Once our raw materials are processed, we should have a liquid that is full of sugar and ready for fermentation. In whiskey making, we mill our grains into a flour called grist, mix this with hot water, and extract a sweet liquid called wort. For brandy production, it's enough to crush the grapes to extract their juice, which is already full of simple sugars. Fermentation is the process whereby yeast will be used to transform those sugars into ethanol alcohol, flavour compounds, and carbon dioxide. So we take our sugary liquid and add our yeast, which will start to consume that sugar and naturally produce alcohol and the other byproducts. Taking single pot still whiskey as an example, fermentation typically takes around 60 to 80 hours, and at the end of the process, we will have a fermented liquid that we call wash, which will be around 10% ABV. The type of yeast, temperature, and raw materials will all influence the duration of fermentation, along with the strength of the fermented liquid, and these vary significantly depending on the product. But essentially, after fermentation, we have an alcoholic liquid, like a beer or a wine, which is ready to be distilled into a spirit. The aim of distillation is to refine this, to increase its alcoholic strength and remove certain unwanted flavour compounds. Any beer or wine has far more water in it than alcohol. For example, even at 15% alcohol, wine is nearly 85% water. Water boils or vaporizes at 100 degrees Celsius, while alcohol vaporizes at a lower temperature, about 78.4 degrees. So the trick is to heat a wine or beer, keep the temperature high enough to vaporize the alcohol, but not high enough for the water to evaporate. We do this in a still, which at its simplest is a sort of large kettle. We then condense those alcohol vapors back into a liquid, which will have greatly increased in strength. Usually we do this at least once more to reach a suitable alcohol strength and a level of purity. But again, the specifics of distillation vary a lot between different spirits categories, styles, countries, and individual distilleries. If we take the example of whiskey, we have already seen that pot still and malt whiskies are produced using copper pot stills, and in Ireland, many products are distilled 3 times. Pot distillation is a batch process, so each time we distill, we fill the pot still, heat it up, condense the alcohol vapors, and collect them in a separate receiver tank. After the first distillation, our wash will have gone from about 10% ABV to between 25 and 40%. After the second distillation, we will have a spirit of around 70% ABV. And finally, after the third distillation, our distillate will have reached approximately 84% ABV, giving us a clean, full-bodied, and spicy new make spirit. If we're making a grain whiskey, or indeed a vodka or neutral grain spirit for gin, column stills are a more efficient way of producing a more refined and higher strength spirit through a continuous process, in a more modern type of still. Now, regardless of the raw materials, still type, or spirit category, what comes off the still at the end of distillation is a clear, colourless spirit that can typically range in strength from 70 to about 96% ABV, and which is then ready to be reduced to bottling strength in the case of unaged spirits, or reduced to casking strength for maturation in the case of aged spirits. So if we looked at maturation and bottling next, in the case of aged spirits, after distillation, the spirit is put into casks and stored in warehouses. The Irish Whisky Act stipulates that by law, Irish whisky must be aged for a minimum of 3 years in wooden casks. Other spirits categories will have their own rules around this. American barrels are produced from white oak, known as Quercus alba, and have a capacity of approximately 200 litres. These are the principal type of casks used in most Irish distilleries, and are also very common in the Scotch whisky industry. They were previously used to age American whiskey, either bourbon or Tennessee whiskey, and they typically impart distinctive flavours and aromas such as vanilla, honey, coconut and spices. The second most common type of casks used in Irish whiskey are sherry casks, known as sherry butts. These originate from the south of Spain. They're made from European oak, known as Quercus robur, and are 500 litres in capacity. They impart notes of dried fruit, cinnamon and fruitcake. Think Christmas cake. A number of reactions between the wood and the spirit take place during maturation, the most significant being a contribution to the colour and the flavour of the whiskey. The whiskey actually starts to take on colour and flavour as soon as it's put into the wood. In Ireland, each barrel loses about 2% of its volume through evaporation each year. This is called the angel's share. The percentage loss will vary depending on the climate and temperature variations in the warehouses, with some distilleries in hotter parts of the world experiencing angel's shares of over 10%. Once the spirit has reached maturity, after the legal aging period, but often after much longer in the cask, it is ready to be blended with the spirit from other casks of whiskey, according to the specific recipe for a given product. Most whiskies are produced in batches, which may contain a few casks or many. Prior to bottling, water is typically added to reduce the whiskey to the appropriate bottling strength. The legal minimum is 40%, but this may be higher depending on the product. One increasingly popular alternative is to bottle the whiskey at the natural strength at which it came out of the cask. This is known as cask strength. This will often be in the mid to high 50s% ABV. Then, once bottled, the whiskey is ready to be enjoyed. So again, I hope you found this introduction to spirits production helpful.